we're not going to take time to introduce ourselves individually, but please name yourself and your organization in your Zoom picture if you haven't done it already. Our meeting will be about 2 hours long with no breaks, so feel free to step away from the computer as needed. Thank you. I'm Chris Johnson, and I'm co-chair of the Network 49 Education Committee. Betsy Vandercook, our other co-chair, and other members of our committee are all here. So you guys please wave so you know who we are. Thanks. Network 49 is an independent political organization in the 49th Ward, and the Network 49 Education Committee has been active in the fight against charters since our beginnings 7 years ago. We stopped the opening of the Noble Street Charter in the neighborhood in 2015. We passed a ward-wide referendum to freeze charter expansion in 2016, and we fought hard for the fair tax in 2020. It passed in our ward with the highest percentage of any place in the state. Yay. Our members are active on our local LSCs, and we've worked for several years with Kelly Cassidy, our state rep, to end the state requirement that LSC members be fingerprinted. And we're still working on that. So why did we call this meeting? We see public education, free, equitable, fully funded, and vibrant as foundational in a democratic society. But we've seen the growing threats and attacks on public education as anti-democratic forces push to privatize our public schools and our public school systems. In particular, we see 3 areas of threat in the coming period. One is the tax credit scholarship program, Invest in Kids, that siphons public tax money into private and parochial schools. Invest in Kids was passed in 2017 with a sunset clause. It's supposed to end next year, 2023. But we already know that will be a big push to make it permanent. We want to see the program end. Second is the further growth of charters. There's been a slowdown of charter expansion in Chicago, but that could change if there's a change in city or state leadership. We've seen the horrific damage done in our city by disinvestment, school closures, and the growth of charters. We are committed to preventing further charter expansion in Chicago and in Illinois. And that brings us to the third issue that we're very concerned with: campaign finance limits for school board elections. We know that pro-charter forces with nearly unlimited funds will enter the school board elections in 2024. That's why we're calling for the legislature to pass limits on campaign financing for those elections now. So we know that the other attacks on schools continue. This year's budget cuts are part of the decades-long disinvestment in Chicago public schools and in the education of Black and Brown children in our city. Statewide, we see well-funded right-wing attacks on school boards and even on individual teachers that focus on race and gender issues, censorship, and COVID mitigation efforts. These are part of an ongoing effort to undermine, discredit, and eventually end public education. So how do we best protect our schools from these many-pronged efforts to discredit public education and to divert public resources for private, exclusive, and inequitable schooling? Our education committee is small but mighty. We're determined and hardworking, but we need allies. And that's why we called this meeting. We're hoping tonight to learn more about the privatization threats we all face, to get to know each other better and understand each other's issues and goals, to learn from our state legislators about what they see happening in the coming year and how we can best stand up for legislation that protects public schools. And most of all, we'd like to lay the foundation for further work together. So how we can communicate across our organizations and support each other as we face these critical threats. So let's get started with the first segment of our agenda. We have 3 speakers tonight who will set the table for our discussion on privatization. First, we'll hear from Dr. Stephanie Farmer, a sociology professor at Roosevelt University, who we first met in the fight to stop the Noble Charter in Rogers Park. She'll give us the Chicago perspective on charters and disinvestment. And next, to give us a statewide perspective, we'll have Diane Horowitz, who's from the Illinois Families for Public Schools. Illinois families led the fight to stop the tax credit scholarship legislation in 2017. And then finally, we'll have Carol Burris, Executive Director of the Network for Public Education, the national advocacy organization founded by Diane Ravitch. Carol can give us a national perspective on privatization and the efforts around the country to stop them. So let's get started. Dr. Farmer, could you go first, please? Thanks.
Sure thing. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Stephanie Farmer. I'm a professor of sociology at Roosevelt University. I do specialize in just in general, like urban finance issues. Started focusing on public transit, shifted to public education. Is it possible for me to share my PowerPoint? Like, is that
it should work if you have
a share screen available for everybody? So what I'm basically going to do is march you through the research that I've basically conducted over the last decade. But I'm putting it all together so that way you can get a visual of this is basically going to provide the background of how like school choice reforms have actually created this fiscal crisis that at least Chicago public schools are in, and that these are lessons that I think other districts can learn from as well. This is also a paper that I'm going to be publishing with my research partner, Rachel Weber at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So I wanted to give her props for this research as well. Looks like a lot of slides. Don't worry. I'm just going to march us through this. And I'm looking at the decisions that were made by CPS basically to institute this kind of school choice reform that was in an effort to create a marketplace of schools for parents to be able to choose from a wide variety of schools. And in order to create a wide variety of schools, they had to literally create, a number of new type of schools, or at least expand their offering of schools that are beyond just like the neighborhood boundary area type of schools. And you all know like the school choice reform, so I'm not going to go too in depth with it, but I will like say that like when you look at when this kind of school choice reform was initiated in the 90s, so this is well preceding Rahm Emanuel, our data goes back to 95. Between 95 and 2018, Chicago opens 230 new schools. When you take in consideration the 123 schools that they closed in that same period, you see a net gain of 107 new type of schools. Many of them are either charter schools or they're going to be these kinds of like what CPS will label as like these kind of performance schools. And some of this also includes the neighborhood schools as well. But I think what's really interesting is that as they're expanding their school, the number of schools by 107, CPS is losing 15% of its population. So when you kind of graph this out, like the bold line here is looking at the enrollment figures start to take a nosedive around 2005, even though this is also the point where you see just a massive expansion that happens as CPS has already seen their enrollment figures take this nosedive. And I will say at a period like in 2000 even, CPS's own demographers were predicting this demographic decline. So they even were expecting this as of 2000, and yet they continue to make the decisions to roll out these new schools. And you can also look, what I think is pretty interesting here too, is that if you look at the rollout of the new charter schools, the massive expansion of charter schools actually takes place after you see the demographic decline happening within Chicago and not before. So it is kind of curious as to like why they were expanding at such a rate as they were doing when in fact, the school age population was shrinking. And I do want to point out too that where they were placing these charter schools were often in neighborhoods where you saw like some of the largest enrollment declines. If you look between like 2000 and 2015, 85% of charter schools were open in areas that were already experiencing large population decline. In fact, when we like mapped it out, 62% of these new charter schools were located in neighborhoods that had a 25% or greater loss in the student age population. So they were not just only deciding to expand the number of schools, but they were locating the charter schools in neighborhoods that had significant population declines. Again, just bad decision after bad decision after bad decisions happening here. So of course, this is going to impact expenditures, especially when you're talking about not just like the expansion of charter schools, but the new schools that are added into the system and all of the other litany of reforms that are taking place, whether it's to put new police officers or, inside the schools. You could talk about like the standardized testing protocols. All of that together is going to expand the costs that are happening with inside CPS, particularly at the same time that we're seeing enrollment declining. So the cost isn't correlating with the actual like consumer demand, if you will. It's correlating more with the choices that are being made inside the school system. And I will say that, and just to kind of narrowly focus down into like how charter schools are impacting the budget. If you look, and this is just looking at 2006. So when the demographic cliff starts to, decline here, charter schools are consuming about 3% of CPS's budget. By 2018, they're consuming 11% of CPS's operational budget. And I will say, in order to roll out these new schools, it's not the case that the city was getting more money from either local tax revenues or state revenues, that they were largely debt financing the rollout of these new schools. You have particular types of like debt mechanisms that were used for the public schools. And then we can also talk about the debt type of mechanisms that were used to finance like these kind of partially privatized like charter schools, right? But nonetheless, in order to finance this like school choice expansion, you also then have, a massive explosion within the long-term debt. This is looking at 95 when CPS literally had $0 in debt. And then you go to 2018 and now we're over $8 billion in debt. And I want to say too that like this entails that that debt service starts to like outpace or not necessarily outpace, how would I say this, that like the growth of debt service, having to pay off this long-term debt is not only eating up a larger share of the budget, but you can see at this time that teacher salaries are as like a proportion of CPS debt is actually like smaller while the debt service is growing. I want to point out that this is a dual access grid, so you have to read it that this is looking at debt service in millions of dollars from $100 million to $1 billion here. And then on this side of the graph, you're looking at teacher salaries, which is starting at $1.7 billion. But nonetheless, I wanted to juxtapose these two trends in order to demonstrate that like working class people's like salaries are like consuming less of CPS's budget, while like the investment world is consuming a greater share of CPS's budget. And then and that's like mostly looking at what's happening, at least with the expansion of CPS's public schools. When you look at what's the charter schools, like you can also see that it's not just that the schools are being like debt financed merely within the CPS agency, public school agency itself, but you also have to look at like the impact on like local and state level budgets as well. In order to roll out particularly like these really well politically connected charter school networks, that they were able to secure money from the city and state budgets. So not only does CPS's budget, debt expands, but we're also looking at how like the school choice reform contributes to the debt expansion that's happening at the city and state levels as well. And this is just like a snapshot. This doesn't even, like the data here doesn't even cover the full gamut of the debt that was taken out to finance charter schools. But this is just like I said, a snapshot of like how much debt was taken out to finance charter school expansion. And then at the same time in the 2000s, it's not just that CPS is expanding its use of like kind of more traditional debt instruments, but then they start to switch into like try to act as like these kind of like public sector innovators within the financial world, and they start to use these more exotic debt instruments that you could talk like, this is talking about variable rate and auction rate bonds. These mean basically that your interest rate is going to fluctuate as opposed to having a fixed interest rate. Public agencies, when they tend to, at least, before the 2000s, when they would borrow money, it would be at a fixed interest rate. So you could actually plan inside your budget and you weren't necessarily like, beholden to the whims of the market. But when they switched to use these variable and auction rate bonds, this entailed like this kind of like shifting our like interest rate, which could potentially give you gains if like the interest rate was swinging your way. But of course, what happened against CPS is that the interest rate swung against them. And they were also using interest rate swaps and these other types of like debt tools of like option payments. That what we found combined is that because of CPS's kind of flirtation with like the financial world, that it contributed to the debt by $617 million in terms of like the variable rates that they were paying relative to what they would have paid if they'd just taken out these loans at the fixed interest rate, plus the penalties that they were incurring, because the penalties are kind of tied to these particular debt instruments. I'm not going to go too much into the details on the debt instruments. When you also
Stephanie, I want to give you a little time update. You have about a minute and a half left.
So then when you think about how are they going to pay for this too, it's not just only that the debt financing it, but they're going to finance it by basically not paying into the the CPS employees pension system. And then of course, as a result, the state steps in, amps up the debt, the pension ramp. And then as a result, CPS now has to pay an extra increment on top of what the employer contribution should be. So overall, what this does is that we make this argument that it creates this kind of structural crisis within CPS. And that if you take in consideration the total expansion of charter cost, debt service, plus the pension ramp cost, that now CPS has much greater like fiscal problems than what was occurring before the 2000s or before the school choice reforms were taken place. And then as a result, then you have all these kinds of cuts to frontline education. You have to pay your bonds back. You have to pay your financial penalties. You have to pay for expansion. So what gets lost? And what gets lost is that now we have fewer educational professionals inside schools. We have less frontline education expenditures. When you look at textbooks, supplies, supports, all of these sorts of like things that are needed inside the classrooms and not just the building itself. And then, as we all know, CPS also instigated closing schools simply because they couldn't afford it. And so when you look at the 125 schools that CPS closed in this time, Nearly 90% of them are in Black neighborhoods. And I would say, I do want to point out that like 70% of these closed schools were within a 1.5-mile walking distance to a charter school. And I'm using 1.5 miles because that's what CPS uses as their standard for what constitutes acceptable walking distance to a school. And now I'm done.
Thank
Wow.
you so much. Thank you so much, Steph.
You're muted.
I thought I was done.
No, you're done. Chris is
Yeah.
muted.
Yeah, I was muted. Sorry about that. Thank you, Stephanie. That was amazing and horrifying summary of what's going on in our schools. And I appreciate it.
And Carol wanted to know first.
And also people are asking if they can have copies of your slides. So, okay, we'll get those out there. All right, thank you. And now for a look at what's gone on with the tax credit scholarships. We have Diane Horowitz.
So
And 10 minutes, Diane.
I timed it, I think so. So Cassie, this is a joint thing between, whoops, where do all these other things come from? Oh, there we go. So these are Cassie's, Cassie and I did some slides also, and we're gonna, make these, send these to everybody. So I'm gonna have to tell her because it's her screen to click. So go to the next one, Cassie. So we're here to talk about the tax credit scholarship program in Illinois, mainly because, as Chris pointed out, in 2017, when this was definitely not on a lot of people's radar, we tried to develop a coalition. We did develop a coalition around tax credit scholarships, which I'll talk about in a second. So before I get into the details about what is a tax credit scholarship for people who don't know, how does it work, what was the legislation passed in 2017, who was behind this, and where we're at now, I just want to sort of emphasize what Chris said before, and that is, I'm sure you all know that this is just part of a larger effort in Illinois to really discredit, defund, and ultimately dismantle public education. And up here we put slides from two of the, and I'll talk about them a little bit later too, two of the worst organizations, right-wing organizations in Illinois that have been gearing up around this. And you can very clearly see on this, parents are looking for different learning options, or parents are locked out of, good private schools, and they're both salivating to get into this. So go ahead to the next one. So where did it go? Here we go. So the next 4 slides I'm going to kind of go through really quickly, because this is sort of the backdrop. And I just want to say that we become more and more aware at Illinois families about what's going on in Illinois around the right-wing attempts to discredit public education. We worked with Indivisible Illinois to have a forum where hundreds of people came in. And I don't remember, Cassie, if you remember, there were at least 40 or 50 different towns throughout Illinois that were representatives. So people are working on this, and I'm sure you're all aware of this nationally, the anti-COVID mitigation, people, the small but very vocal, very loud groups that are protesting books, certain books, issues around gender, you all know this, sex education, CRT, really a fight against teaching anything about race and so forth and so on. But behind all of these, of course, is the goal, even though some of the people here are very strongly against some of the things I talked about before. And Cassie, go to the next one. The real goal behind this is to ultimately privatize the schools. And so these are exactly what I'm talking about. Some of the culture war issues that people are raising that are in the news. And I was amazed to see I think we were, just how extensive this is in Illinois. Okay, so go to the next one. And yeah, so this is just a list. Actually, these are a couple of months old of a very small list. And there's many more of some of these disruptions throughout the state. And because I want to get to tax credit scholarships, we'll send this around to people. So go to the next one. I think this is, yes, this is really important. So this is a list of some of the many right-wing groups that are active in K through 12. Each of them have different things that they focus on, but ultimately all of them are united ideologically in terms of privatization. I don't know if we're going to have time for this, Cassie, to go on the website of Awake Illinois, the one I sent you. Yeah,
Yes,
do you have that website, Kathy? I don't know. There was a website. I guess we don't.
You want me to go and show it?
I don't know. I guess we don't have to do it. Yeah, let's just go back. People can find this, but that one of the things on their website was a whole thing about how horrible Illinois public schools were. And I think this is the group, yes, that you can see on their website, they're dying to get their hands on some of this tax credit scholarship money because they want to establish a series of Christian private schools that come under the heading of grace. And I think Tom DeVore, who is this guy that some of you may have read about in the paper that had the suit against mass mandates, is involved in this. And Illinois Policy Institute is another very important one. They fund a lot of initiatives. Of course, they do much more than education policy. And I think they were involved in our 2017 tax credit scholarship fight as well. Okay, go to the next one. I think the next one is, so that's just some sense of who's there in Illinois. And this is just scratching the surface in a couple of minutes of the many groups that are going to be really gearing up around the tax credit, the new tax credit scholarship fight. So what is a tax credit scholarship? When I first learned about this, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I had no idea what it was. So I just want to talk about the difference between a voucher plan and tax credit scholarships. Voucher plans are not in Illinois yet. So in a voucher plan, the state takes taxpayer dollars and pays families directly to cover the tuition costs at a private school. And it could be a religious school as well as just a secular private school. In contrast, a tax credit scholarship, a private business or an individual can contribute their donations to either to private schools or to scholarship granting organizations that then distribute the scholarship to individuals. And I'll talk about how that works in a second. And in that case, the contributors, the person you contribute this money will get tax credits. And there are 2 other examples as well. We don't have time to go into them, but all of them have the same purpose, decreasing the public dollars available for public schools by diverting taxpayers' dollars to subsidize families' choice to send child to private rather than public schools. Okay, next. Lots of problems with voucher schemes. I've already talked about how it diverts money from public schools to private schools. I think one important thing is that a lot of the discussion of the pro-voucher or pro-tax credit scholarship people are that these programs will improve academic outcomes rather than letting kids languish in public schools. But there's been a ton of research studies and I think Carol Burris probably knows more about them than I do nationally, that show, in fact, there is either little or, almost no academic advantage to going to them. The Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, Ralph Martiri's organization that many of you know about, did one, and we can send the link to it, of Indiana students, kids who got vouchers for private schools and followed them. Virtually no gains. And of course, there isn't transparency and accountability of public spending to the private schools that get the vouchers, whose kids go there. There's no guarantee of students' rights. Private schools aren't covered by the same civil rights laws that our public schools are. Okay. So in 2017, the state legislature passed the Invest in Kids Act. Who is behind this? My understanding, and Cassie, you can help with this, is that my remembrance of this is that there was very little public debate among legislators about this bill. But instead, then leaders Madigan and Cullerton made a deal with pro-privatization Governor Rauner and the Cardinal to get this passed. So the law went into effect in 2017, but was supposed to be repealed in a year and a half from now or so, in January 2025, unless the Illinois General Assembly renews. And that's what our next steps are going to be to work on. So how does it work? So next one, Cassie. Oh, no, I wanted to say this. So here's our, I don't know if you can see this whole thing, but here is, here are our coalition partners. And when I just looked at this again, some of you are on there. There's Brighton Park, there is Parents for Teachers, there's Network 49. I'm not sure who else is here. I don't think you can see, I can't see it. The ACLU joined. I remember talking to the Anti-Defamation League, who usually I often don't agree with, but very concerned about the issues of public money going into religious schools, Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, League of Women Voters, etc. So we put together a pretty good coalition, maybe a couple dozen groups. We got 34 state legislators sign a letter to Rauner opposing any program, but it passed. So how does it work? How much time do I have, Chris? I can't hear.
Chris, you're muted.
Chris, you're muted. I don't know how much time I have because I'll go really fast.
You're still muted.
Oh my gosh. I have no idea how much time I have. Oh, so here is how it works. You can contribute $1 million and get a
Diane, you have 1 more minute.
Oh my gosh, I'm going to go really fast then. This is how it works. You get a 75% credit against your income tax. The maximum is $1 million. So all you can contribute top is 1.333 million. I'm just going to, Cassie, just click on the rest of them. We will have these. This is a slide about, go back one, about the scholarship granting organization. I think one of the main ones is Empower Illinois, which is a Catholic, from the Catholic Church. Go back. So this is who can receive, this is how it works. The next one, which you will have, is who can receive scholarships, what's the criteria, how is the amount determined? Okay, the next slide shows how this is awarded by region. Keep going because I want to get to the very end here. Where are we at now? Go to the last slide since I just have a minute here. So what's next? Here are some, there's going to be a big legislative campaign. In fact, on the Empower website, it said something like, in very big letters, our planning is underway for the next legislative campaign. So it means our planning has got to be on the way for the next legislative campaign. But this is their wish list. Chris mentioned something about, she saw something that maybe it was the Illinois Policy Institute wanted to expand it to also include maybe preschools or vocational schools. We don't know, but we will soon find out. Again, I'm going to leave you with two things. One, they're starting to plan. They have a lot of money. Illinois Policy Institute has a ton of money. More of these right-wing groups like Awake Illinois, we're not around them, so we can expect them to join the fray. We have to expand our coalition, develop an education campaign around this. My sense from 5 years ago is most people had no idea what tax credit scholarships were. And I just want to say one very last thing. If you are an individual, you know, who wants to send your kid to a private school, or you're a state legislator who is considering supporting the tax credit scholarship program, the expansion of this program, I think people have to realize that every state legislature has to realize that they cannot see this initiative as an isolated program, that this is part of supporting the agenda of the right wing, and it's a foot in the door. It is, as Chris says, helping, the tax credit scholarship program is helping to undermine the importance of democratic public school education in Illinois.
Well, thank you, Diane. That was really informative and puts it in the perspective of the wider fight against the right-wing attacks that we're looking at. So finally, and we have a national perspective from Carol Burris. She's the executive director of the Network for Public Education, and we're very happy to have you here to talk with us tonight. Carol.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I have a PowerPoint that somebody was going to, are you going to get it? Okay, as he's getting it, let me give you some, I think, critical background information that really reinforces what the first two speakers had to say. There was there we go, great, thank you. If you could kind of get it up to the first slide, and then we should be all set. That's the last slide. There we go, great, thank you. So anyway, it was Fox News the other day. I don't watch it, but every now and then there's a clip that flies around. And it was 4 women sitting around a table, speaking casually as if they were talking about where they were going to go out to lunch. And one of them said, well, we really don't need public schools, do we? And to which another person agreed and said, yeah, well, why can't the money just follow the child? And why do we even need public education? They were saying this as if this was their revelation, but of course it's not. It's the long-standing plot and goal that began back in the 1950s with Milton Friedman, and which has accelerated at an extraordinary rate. I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. If you could go to the next slide. This is where we are. If you look at a national landscape, there are 60 voucher programs in the United States. They're in 30 states and in the District of Columbia. And when I say 60 voucher programs, I'm including the traditional voucher program, along with the ESA scholarship program and what you have in Illinois, which is the tax credit program. I mean, the tax credit and the ESAs, they're just a way to get around often state constitutions that don't allow for direct vouchers. Now, not a large number of students use them, which is the good news. In 2020, 2021, about 500,000 students, a little more than 500,000 students actually use vouchers. It's going to be interesting to see in the next few years if that number grows. And of course, part of the reason is that it usually partially pays for an education as opposed to a charter school where the entire bill is paid for by the public. And that's why, what you see is that the last speaker just talked about it, right? It's sort of this camel's nose under the tent program where they'll start very small. The tax credit will be small. The number of students who are able to apply is small. And then they gradually expand and expand and expand. Now, in terms of charter schools, things have really gotten to a critical place. 45 states in the District of Columbia now have charter school laws. A few of the states that were holdouts fell recently. For example, Kentucky had a fairly recent law and they were never funded. Well, this legislative session, they managed through some very sneaky maneuvers to fund the charter schools. And so therefore they're going to start popping up, I'm sure, next year. In 12 states, charter schools now enroll more than 10% of the share of public school children. I put that in quotes, meaning 10% of the kids that are enrolled either in public schools or in charter schools. And while I had that 10% threshold, there are places where it's 30%, Washington, D.C., it's 40%. The numbers are a lot higher. And then there are some places like Virginia where only a school district can authorize a charter school and make the decision, where you have a proportion of less than 1% of the kids in charter schools. Nationally, around 3.5 million students are enrolled in charter schools. Now, you all saw that report last year, Vote with Their Feet, where the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools sort of rubbed everybody's nose in the fact that they had a big increase in charter school enrollment. We questioned that right away. We said it's all in the really terrible online schools. Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. We're going to be releasing it shortly. Charter school enrollment for the first time in charter school history has gone down this year. So they may have voted with their feet, but a lot of them now are walking to the exit. And I suspect that enrollment is even going to go down a little bit next year, especially as kids exit the online schools that they went to because of the pandemic. The only two states left, the only two that do not have a publicly funded alternative to public schools are Nebraska and North Dakota. That's it. Everybody else has at least a charter school, or in the case of Vermont, they don't have charter schools, but they have town tuition programs, which are essentially vouchers. Next slide, please. So I talked about this a little bit before. You have your traditional voucher programs, 25 programs in 21 states. Some states are just voucher crazy. Ohio has 5 different programs. Your tuition tax credit program, like you have in Illinois, 26 programs in 21 states. There are some places that do give 100% tax credit. And I mean, all that is it's a gift to public funds, right? Because everything, it's not like a charity. It's not like you make a donation to your local, Catholic school, and then you get a tax deduction for it. This means that everything you give, you get back. So it's very, very different. Essentially, it's the state funding a voucher program. Then there are the ESA programs. There are 9 ESA programs in 9 states. They are the absolute worst of the worst. They usually also fund homeschooling. So you have all kinds of fraud where people get what they would have, what their children, the public school would have spent on their children on a debit card, which they get to go shopping with. And all kinds of shenanigans happen as people buy educational supplies and then return them to Walmart and get a gift card and buy other things and TVs. In Arizona, you don't even have to show that your child learned. There is nothing, not even a portfolio that you hand in at the end of the year. You qualify for an ESA the next year by using up all the money that you used up this year. It's scary, and it terrifies me for children. Charter schools we talked about, 45 states and the District of Columbia. Next slide, please. So what's the problem with all of this? What are some of the reasons, other than the fact that we love public schools and democracy, that we should be opposed to it? Well, a lot of it is taxpayer-funded discrimination in vouchers. 81% of the states with programs allow voucher schools to discriminate in entrance requirements based on religion. 74% allow discrimination based on student and or parent LGBTQ status. There's a lack of safety protections. Nearly half of all of the states that have one or more voucher programs, and some of them have several. I mean, Florida, I think, is up to about 8 different varieties of vouchers and neo-voucher programs. They don't require background checks for teachers. I mean, there's one story of a voucher school in Florida where the principal had been arrested for child molestation, opened up a school. There was no background check. No one knew. Came out, it shut down. And guess what? He opened up another school. I mean, you can't make some of the horror up. I would say it's also wasteful spending. Now, advocates will say, well, you know, you're not spending as much to educate the child with the voucher as you would if the child were in a public school. But the truth of the matter is, more than half of these programs pay out more than 50% of what would have been spent to educate the child in a public school. And most of them allow parents who have never sent their child to a public school to be able to take a voucher. So essentially, it's funding families who have always been able to afford the tuition, who are still able to afford the tuition, but now they're getting this gift of public funds. Elimination of students' rights. 94% of states with voucher programs are either silent on the rights of students with disabilities or actually require families to sign away their rights under IDEA in order to get a voucher. There's no obligation to follow due process rights in discipline or in expulsion. And I'm actually thinking this 94% is low because since our report came out, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I had a group contact me and say, no, Washington, D.C. does not preserve all of the rights of students with disabilities. So I have to look into that. So it's probably a little bit worse than I even have there. Inadequate education. 7 states publicly fund homeschooling. 19 states don't require teachers in voucher programs to be certified. And 26 states don't require that voucher students take the same state tests. Some of them will say, okay, kids have to take the SAT, but it's not comparable data. That's why somebody said before, what about the studies of the voucher programs? Well, the ones that there are not, do show that kids don't do particularly well with vouchers. Most of them actually start to lose learning. But the truth of the matter is we really don't know because they're not requiring the students to take the same test. And I'm not a big lover of tests. I mean, I was very active in the opt-out movement. But if you are going to require students in the public sector to take tests, then you should also require them in the voucher sector. That's not the case. Next slide. Very briefly, problems with charters, right? We took a look at that. Disregard for students' rights. 30 of the 43 states, students do not have the same rights and protections as public school students during the disciplinary and expulsion process. For many years, I was a high school principal in New York State. I could not expel a student until they were at the age of 17. And luckily, never felt the need to do that. However, charter schools in New York State can expel students as young as kindergarten. 39 states give enrollment preferences to students beyond disadvantaged students. They'll have enrollment preferences such as if you have a sibling that attends the school, you're the child of a teacher, the child of a founder, the child of a board member. What winds up happening is, okay, they have the lottery, but the slots are pretty much already filled. And there are even 4 states that allow academic and talent screening in order to be able to attend a charter school. Again, I believe in adequate education. 32 states either do not require that the teachers be certified, or they have so many exemptions that it makes certification meaningless. 32 states allow fully virtual online charter schools, which are the worst of the worst. The GAO just came out with a blistering report on the fully virtual online charter school sector, where for-profit management companies dominate. I highly recommend it. With a conference, I haven't had time to write about it yet, but I will. Profiteering. 36 states and DC allow for-profit corporations to run nonprofit charter schools. So they're all the only one that allows the charter school itself to be a for-profit. The only state is Arizona. However, everybody else knows how to get around the law. And what they do is they form a nonprofit board, usually the for-profit, like Academica, National Heritage Academies, SL, I mean, you could go on and on. What they do is they then contract to provide all of the services with something called a sweeps contract. And what that means is that all of the tax dollars that go to the nonprofit board of the charter school immediately are swept in to the for-profit management company, which then controls the schools. They do everything. They hire the teachers, they hire the principals, they own the buildings, and then they lease the buildings. They own the curriculum, they own the books, they own everything. So especially in Ohio, when you have a charter school that says, hey, wait a minute, I don't want to be part of this anymore, you can't get out of it because you don't have a school left, right? And then there's all kinds of horrible things where there's not even any real separation. We have so many states that allow the owners of the education management organization to actually even serve on the charter board. We found some in Arizona where 2 out of 3 members of the nonprofit board were owners of the EMO company and the building that serviced the charter school. Waste, fraud, and grift, that is everywhere. We keep track of it. We have on our website, you can find Another Day, Another Charter School Scandal, where we list article after article, and you can search by state on all of the different stories that we find in the news regarding charter school malfeasance and abrupt closures, as well as just, take the money and run disgusting scandals. When we started it, and I called it Another Day, Another Charter School Scandal, I thought I was exaggerating. I figured that maybe we'll have one a week. I got to tell you, folks, it's another day, another charter school scandal, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. And considering how small this sector is in relation to public schools, that's pretty shocking. Next slide.
Carol,
Yep.
we're just about out of time.
Okay. All right. So you know what? You got it. You talked about it. Cato Institute has been laying it out, making the case. Boy, we have all of these people fighting at school board meetings. We just can't operate public schools anymore. And so the solution is to privatize the entire system. The arguments are being made. The smoke signals are being sent. This is happening. It is happening rapidly. If you could go to the next slide, this is our new report. You can find it on our website, Public Schooling in America. And Pretty much everything that I told you, plus more, is available in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. That was that was sobering, to say the least.
Carol,
But
is
very
that report, is it available right now?
Yes, it is.
It
You
is.
know what?
Okay,
I will get a link and I'll put it in the chat.
that'd be
Excellent.
fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.